Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Gene Chaosofsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftusness and Jared Jeter about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor that publishes every Friday alongside this podcast. So today we're going to start with a brief roundup of all the major developments happening in each of the global hotspots, including the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, and Indo-Pacific, and also be taking a quick look at some developments out of the U.S. and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We'll then follow up with a discussion on the recent U.S. trade war with Canada, as well as exploring its regional and global implications. But before that, let's jump into our roundup. So over to you to start us off, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. All right, so let's start things off with the Middle East, where we saw a trend towards the hybrid escalation scenario. The most important top lines to be aware of is that the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, rolled out a series of sanctions against dozens, we're talking 60 plus entities, many, of course, Iranian, but there's an international spread in there, and threatened harsh economic consequences really against any country that continues to engage in trade with Iran. Now, I will note that as of today, we have not yet seen any of those follow-on sanctions, but I'm sure we'll discuss that more in the future. Yesterday, August 26th, Iran and Oman reached a bilaterally negotiated agreement to facilitate maritime passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Those talks are something that we've been covering for a little while now. That is an important update, but again, with the U.S., the current posture of the U.S. with its forces in the region basically negates that deal and prevents its implementation, at least for the time being. We have not yet seen any official commentary on that deal from the White House. Speaking of the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump sent a proposed U.S.-Saudi nuclear deal to Congress for ratification that starts a 90-day clock for Congress. Now, the important thing to be aware of there is that Trump has stipulated that this deal is dependent on Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords and formally recognizing Israel, which, of course, is a major impediment. Now, looking at Syria, significant news from there as well. The SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, reached an agreement with the central government in Damascus to dissolve the organization as a separate entity and integrate at least in part into the Syrian army. Now, when I say in part, I'm referencing the YPJ, which are the women's units of the SDF that played a significant role in the fight against ISIS. This one is kind of flying under the radar this week with everything else going on in the region and globally, but it can't be stressed how big of a deal this actually is for the stabilization of Syria and really the region. Turning our attention now to Europe, we saw transatlantic relations and the Russia-Ukraine war also trend towards the hybrid escalation scenario. A very interesting development over this week. CIA Director John Ratcliffe made an unannounced trip to Moscow a couple days ago on August 25th. And this was, of course, not reported at the time. But after the fact, we now understand that he met with senior Russian officials, not Vladimir Putin that I'm aware of, but senior officials nonetheless, and warned them against escalatory action that the U.S. believes Russia is preparing to take against specifically Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Quite a significant development there. Of course, we do not have the details of that meeting beyond that. Now, Poland, Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands are uniting in a diplomatic push to get Brussels to come to the table and reconsider the use of Russian frozen assets to aid Ukraine. This has been a big, long-running story really for the last several years. That effort kind of fell apart a number of months ago. There was a lot of fear on the continent of Russian retaliation, but now that effort is being revived. British Prime Minister Andy Burnham, meanwhile, is grabbing a number of headlines with his staunch support of Ukraine. On the 24th, during a visit to Kyiv, he said that the United Kingdom plans to assist Ukraine in upscaling the its domestic development capabilities, specifically of long-range missiles that it will use to strike deep into Russian territory, and it plans to do so by sharing classified technical data from British weapons systems. The Ukrainians have been continuing and really very steadily escalating their campaign, not just against Russian energy infrastructure, but now commercial industry targets as well. They hit a Wildberries warehouse. Now, in case you're not familiar with that name, Wildberries is essentially the Amazon of Russia. To put them into context, we've seen a number of such attacks over the last few weeks. This one in particular killed at least 3 people on August 26th. And then finally, some rare diplomatic news out of Ukraine, rare these days at least. Zelensky said that he senses a window of opportunity within the next few months to bring Russia to the table. And to that end, he has put together a 1-page peace proposal. We don't know what's in that document right now, but Zelensky is saying it's based on input from both the U.S. and the Europeans. And then his intention is that the U.S. will then present that document to Russia. All right, guys, that's all I got for my sections. Jared, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. So this week in the Indo-Pacific trended toward hybrid escalation scenarios. Starting off with the U.S.-China relationship, the U.S. is set to impose a 7.5% tariff on Chinese goods over allegations of excessive manufacturing capacity, which is going to be taking place before the planned Trump-Xi summit, going to be taking place in mid-September, according to people familiar with the matter. This move would restore the Trump administration's second-term duties on China to around 20%, a level that Beijing has previously said is consistent with its trade truce with Washington. Occurring around the same time is the U.S. Department of Justice apparently disrupted a Chinese-backed hacking operation, which was conducted against several different government departments. Meanwhile, still in the U.S.-China relationship, U.S. Ambassador David Perdue met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi for a preliminary meeting for the Trump-Xi summit. These type of meetings are very common to kind of work out both the schedule and the agenda for what is going to be discussed, and that's what's going to be taking place in mid-September. For the U.S. and South Korea, the U.S. and South Korea had just released a joint statement following the military drill reduction, which occurred last week. This announcement is noteworthy because it has many omissions. It does not mention any type of North Korean denuclearization or the necessity of it as part of their continued communications with North Korea. This detail is very important as North Korean denuclearization has long been a prerequisite requirement from both the U.S. and South Korean governments for any type of negotiation or deal with North Korea. They've long stressed this. This has been a decades-long policy. But just this week, the South Korean foreign minister said in a statement that the South Korean government is going to maintain close communication and cooperation with both the U.S. and North Korea regarding the nuclear issue, which is it's a very notable deviation from a decades-long policy about this. This, of course, has a lot to do with both the U.S. military drawdown and its desire to kind of have a better diplomatic outreach to North Korea right now. So this is probably where this is coming from, a desire to kind of compartmentalize the U.S. and South Korea's intentions toward North Korea. In Taiwan, the drone funding proposal, which has been debated in the LY for months now, continues to face gridlock as the KMT is refusing to provide its consent for its passing, unless more comprehensive oversight protocols are put in place to help monitor the distribution of the military budget. Many different factions in the KMT have been arguing for different things. The faction kind of led by the chairwoman, Cheng Li-wen, have been advocating for actually a reduction in the military budget, to where more moderate elements of the KMT are advocating that the military budget just have more oversight protocols put in place so that everyone is constantly aware about where this money is going and how it is being handled. And then kind of finishing out with the Russo-Chinese relationship, a Wall Street Journal report details that China has actually been helping Russia in its production of its domestically produced Shahad drones, which it has been licensed from Iran, while at the same time restricting Ukrainian access to components necessary for production of their own surface-to-air interceptors. So this report kind of details that the Chinese statements about being a very neutral party and desiring not to kind of militarily assist either side may not be entirely truthful. Then kind of moving over to the U.S.-Canadian relationship right now, following a bilateral announcement last week that both sides were reaching a trade deal, negotiations have fallen apart and collapsed, leading to the Trump administration imposing a 50% tariff on Canadian dairy, liquor, and a 25% tariff on Canadian auto parts. In response, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a list of 900 U.S. goods estimated at $27 billion, which they would match for a dollar-for-dollar tariff. from 25 up to 50%. And the Canadian tariffs are expected to go into effect on September 8th, and the Trump administration has threatened that further tariffs will be incoming if a deal is not reached by the beginning of next year.
Great. Thanks, Jared and Andrew. So let's now get into our discussion section of the podcast, and we'll actually just pick up where you left off there, Jared, on that obviously very significant breakdown in the U.S.-Canada trade negotiations. So we can discuss here sort of what we expect moving forward as those ripple effects take place, and also the implications not only for that bilateral relationship, but also on regional and perhaps even global trade dynamics as well. So maybe just kind of starting off here, I mean, you mentioned, Jared, that in the near term, those tariffs are expected to go into effect, those heightened tariffs out of both U.S. and Canada on September 8th. So technically speaking, there are still a couple of weeks before that happens. But also Trump has mentioned that further tariffs, could take place if there's not a deal reached by January 2027. So that does give some months, if not over the next couple of weeks, but over the next few months for negotiations to potentially resume. So we're basically looking at somewhere, something in between a hybrid escalation or the potential for further restrictions on trade, and also the potential off-ramp for some kind of diplomatic de-escalation, both of those being on the table. And of course, notably that U.S. midterm elections are kind of taking place in that period in the beginning of November. So maybe just kind of to start us off here, I mean, I think it's worth kind of exploring the strategic kind of perspective or the strategic outlook from both the Trump administration and the Carney administration when it comes to these trade negotiations. Obviously, these talks have been ongoing for quite a while, even going back to, last year with Trump, looking to basically reshape U.S. trade relationships with all of its major partners, and Canada being kind of key among them. So I think it's kind of worth bringing up here in terms of some of the key objectives and constraints that's faced by the Trump administration. So we know that the Trump administration has been really looking to shore up economic growth. That's a key objective, broadly speaking, but also specifically on the trade front. This also includes the return and expansion of domestic manufacturing. So this is one of the key sort of motivating factors behind the U.S. tariff regime globally. U.S. is looking to expand its exports and, of course, cut its trade deficit with all countries, but especially major trade partners like Canada or like China. On the Carney side of things, the strategic objectives are, actually quite similar, but sometimes in contention. So the Carney administration is looking to establish a new economic relationship with the U.S. As it relates to trade, to try to limit the impact of some of those tariffs that the U.S. has passed. It is also looking to expand its own domestic manufacturing base, but partially because of these tensions that we've been seeing out of the trade and tariff picture, we've seen that the Carney administration has looked to diversify its trade partners and even decrease its reliance on the U.S. So a lot of these are, overlapping and some, obviously in conflict. But I think it's really the strategic constraints that will be very telling in terms of how these negotiations or how these trade relations will shake out moving forward. So just a few to kind of mention here before turning it over to you, Jared, is, there's obviously a lot of domestic opposition to U.S. tariffs out of the Trump administration. We've seen that out of the courts, obviously striking down things like the IEEPA tariffs. We've seen some opposition out of Congress, and increasingly we're seeing opposition out of companies. You're talking, agricultural companies, different segments of the U.S. economy, manufacturing, so on and so forth, that are directly impacted by such tariffs. Of course, there's also international opposition to tariffs, which we've seen out of Canada, but also several other countries. And like I mentioned, those upcoming midterm elections, which could be potentially the most important strategic constraint for the Trump administration. And then out of the Carney administration, there's the heavy reliance on U.S. goods. So, even though they are trying to diversify, the U.S. is still a very key market for Canada. And then, of course, the tariffs themselves and the lack of internal markets for Canada are constraints there. So taking into that account, Jared, how do you see things kind of shaping out and what both sides are considering moving forward?
Yeah, one thing I've really been paying attention to is there's been a lot of ink expended on the way that the U.S. is perceiving this and what the Trump administration is planning to do. However, I think what's often going overlooked, particularly by even those in the Trump administration when planning these negotiations, is the electoral issue that the Canadian Prime Minister faces. The Canadian Prime Minister kind of ran on a ticket of being able to oppose American encroachment on the economy and sovereignty. And what that kind of means is now he's locked into that position. He has to take a tough position, or he risks losing his own authority. And so if they just acquiesce to all the American demands, as has been done sometimes in the past, he might not face political survival here. And what it really kind of comes down to, especially in Canada, unlike in the US, they can issue votes of no confidence in their prime ministers. They can be removed mid-administration. And if something like that occurs, then the Carney administration could collapse. So they have to be able to walk away from this with some type of face-saving maneuver. And the kind of more unilateral demands made by Washington would kind of threaten that. And as far as like what you were just saying about U.S. companies, this is another interesting shift that we've been seeing from the Trump administration, is the kind of pro-corporate messaging that is often a staple of the Republican electorate, and the Republican policy positions are actually kind of coming under fire a little bit here from inside their own party, because this is not something that actually benefits the American corporate sector, as you pointed out. This is something that is going to be increasing costs. It's going to be increasing transport costs. It's going to be complicating logistics. This is not something that is actually going to be benefiting American companies or wealthier individuals. This is something that is going to be a kind of a deleterious economic effect all around. So what it's kind of really coming down to is the Trump administration is trying to maintain its perception of the America First policy. It's trying to kind of say that we have the ability to enforce our economic interests around the world as we see fit. And while that is certainly possible with smaller, more dependent nations, Canada is a very important trade partner of the U.S., but it is also large enough to be able to sufficiently resist this, especially when they have their own, administration's political survival on the line. So right now, the Canadian position is very incentivized to make a deal with the U.S. This is hurting the Canadian economy as well. We are their largest trading partner. They really do have to kind of come to some type of an agreement eventually. However, right now, in this immediate sense, within the next month or so, their political survival and much of their economic sovereignty is dependent on kind of standing up to the U.S. and being able to show that, not only can we negotiate on our own 2 feet, but we can resist attempts to control us. So they have a lot of political incentive to not make a deal at this very moment. It could be coming within the next several months. There could be kind of a last-minute deal as we get closer to 2027. But right now, it looks a little bit shaky.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, Jared, especially, looking at the Carney administration's position that this is actually an issue that goes beyond trade itself, right? You mentioned protecting Canadian sovereignty and really the Canadian identity. This is something that I think Carney kind of made himself a little bit infamous, earlier in the year with the Davos summit speech talking about, basically having to reevaluate Canada's relationship with the U.S., not to say that's going to be, searching for alternatives, because that relationship will remain important economically and in the security sphere, but having to basically diversify, look for other trade partners. This was in the face of a lot of tariff pressure, but also security pressure on various NATO issues. So this is really something that goes, beyond, as I said, the trade issue, that the Carney administration just kind of made the calculus that despite the economic fallout that's clearly going to happen, both for Canada and for the U.S., it was worth kind of standing up for Canada's sovereignty, in a sense, in the face of a lot of pressure out of the Trump administration. But Andrew, you wanted to weigh in as well.
Yeah, Jared, I appreciate that overview. In your opinion, what are the differences you're seeing in the way that the Carney administration is messaging to the Canadian population, hey, there's going to be economic pain, but we have to do this. This is why we have to do this, versus the Trump administration messaging to the American public? What's their pitch for, hey, this is why, being on the offensive, so to speak, this is why we have to do this. There's going to be economic pain. What's the messaging there? What's the buy-in that they're trying to achieve?
Yeah, what's really kind of interesting is in a broad stroke, their messaging actually is not that similar. It's the math behind it that's different. Because if you actually look at what the Canadian Prime Minister is saying, they're basically saying we have been the victims of predatory trade policies by the U.S. in the past, and now they're trying to institute a larger amount of control over the Canadian economy, and we're trying to protect our own sovereignty. What's very interesting is the Trump administration kind of makes very similar arguments, not just with Canada, but with to justify most tariffs. They've often kind of operated on the perception that America is being taken advantage of economically. That has been the common rhetoric throughout all of these tariffs, that America is getting a raw deal, that we are paying too high of prices, that these countries and their associated companies are taking advantage of U.S. trade policy to extract as much as they can while providing as little as they can. It's actually a very similar argument. The actual difference between these two realities is that in the American perception, or the American economic reality, we actually do hold a lot more leverage over Canada, and the type of economic policies that we are advocating for would put them in a disadvantageous position, to where the previous economic arrangement, the North American Free Trade Association, as well as the successor institution that was put into place during the Trump administration's first term, those were free trade associations that actually operated on pretty fair bilateral rules. And the kind of disillusion of those institutions and this growing trade conflict has actually caused a lot more of the chaos. So the rhetoric is actually very similar. It's the math about what's happening that is actually the reality of it that's different.
Yeah, and I would just briefly add on to it. I think public opinion is an important component here as well. I mean, if you look at the polling sort of leading up to these negotiations, and even the initial kind of reaction out of it is that the Carney administration actually does have quite a bit of support for its stance and kind of, maintaining that its position, in the face of U.S. pressure. Whereas the Trump administration is not polling, it's got the majority kind of opposing, out of the U.S. on these heightened trade restrictions and tariffs on Canada, right? So in that sense, and especially obviously in an election year and with the midterms coming up in just a couple of months, that would seem to be a major, constraint on the Trump administration. However, I do think it's worth noting here that, the Trump administration has been willing to sort of risk what, potentially most administrations wouldn't. I'm thinking, obviously the actions in Iran, the ongoing conflict there, the fact that there hasn't been an agreement yet, that we're still seeing disruption out of the Strait of Hormuz, and this is with those midterms, quickly approaching. Now, there's been some shifts there, at least away from the military dimension and more of an economic focus on Iran. But Trump himself, or the Trump administration, has been willing to, at least until now, risk that kind of public blowback, understanding that could have a pretty significant impact on the midterms in order to pursue those broader strategic objectives. So that kind of makes it a pretty unique position, vis-a-vis other administrations. I think it's also worth bringing up here, as we're talking about these trade negotiations and, how we can see them shape out. Basically the negotiating style of the Trump administration is relatively unique as well, right? Where we see sort of kind of that maximum sort of demands at first, but we have seen, I think it's worth noting, that the Trump administration has, in some cases backed down, or at least, moderated some of its demands. And that's why I do think that an agreement or some kind of off-ramp with Canada is certainly possible. If not in the next couple of weeks, then certainly within the next few months. It's worth taking a kind of a look at, or noting that the U.S. is also in the midst of a lot of other trade negotiations. I'm thinking with Mexico, with Brazil, which kind of saw a similar, imposition of tariffs, but then kind of a willingness from the Trump administration to then go back to the negotiating table. And of course, the big one that Jared had mentioned earlier on in the briefing section with China, right, where we see a lot of tension, but also a lot of willingness to talk in a very kind of high level capacity, with the aim of, yes, maintaining some level of tariffs. I don't think that those are going to be going away, completely, but willing to negotiate to try to get, a quote unquote better deal on the side of the U.S. So I think all of those countries, China, Brazil, Mexico, Europe, they're all looking very closely to see how the U.S., kind of carries out these negotiations, and whether Canada is actually able to get it back to the negotiating table, or whether the U.S. kind of maintains that pressure.
Yeah, and I think something that's also very important to bring up, which just occurred, was the recent Supreme Court decision that made it clear that states do not, for the moment at least, have the legal right to challenge the Trump administration's executive order on creating their own federal lists of eligible voters. This kind of gets into one of the reasons why they've been taking these more escalatory actions, is because they're having some hope that they're going to have more electoral victories by altering constitutional law a little bit. Now, what the actual order says, to be very specific, is that the federal government will be creating its own list of eligible voters, and any state that sends in any votes that it deems ineligible will be legally prosecuted. Now, the main impacts this is planning to have is mostly on mail-in voting. And the reason why is because mail-in voting has long been a target of the Trump administration. He's often claimed, with very little evidence to no evidence, that it is wildly fraudulent and susceptible to easy tampering. And by being able to change this law, they would actually be able to shift things ever so slightly. It's very almost imperceptible in terms of overall numbers, but with an enormous impact. And that impact being, in a lot of these heavily urban areas, and particularly in swing states where election victories can come down to just like within a fraction of a percentage point, all you would have to do is really declare just a few thousand votes ineligible to completely flip states or entire districts. If this would be allowed to stand permanently as an aspect of American law, then it would be almost impossible for most Democratic administrations or candidates to be able to win any type of nationwide election. Because all you would have to do is just flip a few thousand votes by declaring certain heavily Democratic areas that prefer mail-in voting to be ineligible. It would also have the effect by having this legal prosecution aspect of it, saying that they would arrest election officials that hand them lists that do not match their own federally recognized list. This would also have the effect of intimidating election officials into self-censoring, which would make their legal arguments even easier to make in the future. So this is probably one of the more consequential stories coming out of the U.S. in the last several years. And if this could become a permanent fixture, then this could have enormous implications for almost all American elections going forward. Now, to be clear, what the Supreme Court actually said, the Supreme Court did not rule on the validity of this executive order. The Supreme Court said that states, for the moment, do not have the right to challenge it while other cases against it are pending. So this may still end up being struck down later in lower courts, but for the moment, it does have the ability to go forward. And given the short amount of time before the midterms, it's not likely to change before that. So this could have major impacts on the midterms going forward.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Thanks, Jared. So, really what we're in a situation quite unique as discussed before, going into the home stretch of midterm elections, but there's a number of different challenges that the Trump administration is facing, the unpopularity of the Iran war and the fact that that's been going on now for nearly 6 months with no clear end in sight. We have obviously the trade disruption that we've seen out of the tariffs, although that has manifested itself in a lot of different ways, but clearly the Trump administration is willing to at least risk, this escalation with Canada, at least in the short term. And then what you mentioned, Jared, on kind of the voting front. I think kind of wrapping up maybe on the Canada negotiations, it will be really important to watch not only the kind of the electoral constraints, but also because so many companies, especially that are going to be disrupted, as discussed before on the U.S. side, there's probably going to be and already has been a lot of, lobbying and a lot of influencing for the administration to kind of change its tack on this. So that I think will open, some room for negotiation, probably out of the Canadian side as well. But clearly there's going to be some short-term disruption in that U.S.-Canada trade. A lot of other countries, as I mentioned, watching those talks very closely to see how they can, learn from them or adapt to them in their own negotiations with the U.S. So a very consequential, a very impactful, certainly development moving forward, but one that's far from over even as these trade tariffs have gone into effect. So with that, we'll wrap it up for today. As a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org. And you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for regular updates and forecasting around the world. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jared. Thank you all for listening, and take care.